Today, we are going to talk about the bad draft slot that might be a gift and the aggressive plan to overcome it and dominate tournaments. And often when we talk about zero RB as well, we talk about the opportunity at the back end of the draft to try and differentiate, to try and build that positional advantage. So we're going to talk through it today as well, and we're going to see, and it is going to be based off your recent Apex Experts League where you did draft from the 111. So obviously a challenging group that you're drafting with there in a very challenging format.
Yeah, so Mike Brody does the Apex Leagues, a really fun format. He does a cool job with this Experts League as well. You got Mike Clay, Matt Harmon, JJ, Sigmund Bloom, Rich, Pat, Graham Barfield, Ian, Denny, and Evan Silva. So not only are those guys very bright, group. But yeah, it's a challenging group, but they're a lot of fun. Really enjoy all of those people. So had a good time with that. One of the things when you are drafting against that type of group is that you're not necessarily wanting to draw the 111, but that also made it a perfect format and draft to kind of go through our annual draft plan when you get a bad draft slot. You mentioned how people are looking at the draft slots this season and that there is either a top 4 or a top 5 or a top 6, depending on who you listen to. But definitely after 6, there's something of a tier break once Austin Eckler and or Jamar Chase, depending on who you have in that 6th spot. Once that guy is gone, then you do seem to have a very different draft for anyone who has the 107 to the 112. And that fits with the results that we have from 2017 to 2020. We have a variety of ways to look at this in the Best Ball Win Rate Explorers. I picked Fanball because it's a little bit more neutral. The 101 has actually been terrible because those guys have always been getting hurt. But then the 102 to the 107, very good win rates. They'll start to slide around 108. And by the time you get down to 111, 112, I mean, you are really swimming upstream, right? You're in a terrible situation. You're chasing so many points. And so much of what we look at with zero RB throughout the years has been kind of predicated on this idea of, okay, well, it may not be ideal, but don't chase points if you get stuck in those situations. The interesting thing was that 2021 was very, very different, right? And it seemed like drafters who had a shot at not only Christian McCaffrey, but these elite wide receivers who would come back to the 212 and the 301, that those teams had such an advantage in tournaments that they were going to destroy everybody. But then that's not at all what happened. Actually, the 4 best win rates were from 109 to 112. And we had some players in that range with just crazy win rates. Now, Jonathan Taylor, I mean, his average ADP sort of fluctuated throughout the year. If you're talking about the entire offseason, it was actually above that range. If you're talking about late in the offseason or late in the drafting season, he was actually falling into the 2nd round pretty frequently. But you have guys like Taylor, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, and Austin Eckler, another player who really jumped around from late 2nd to mid 1st. But those guys with elite win rates. Colm, before we get any deeper, what are your thoughts on how fluky that is and kind of this contrast between the 2 running backs with big win rates and Jonathan Taylor? They're more or less the 101 and the 106 versus Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams, who, if anything, have fallen because they were traded to different teams.
Yeah, I think part of it is I don't know if it's fluky, but part of it is the injuries that happened to those guys that went early in the drafts in 2021, and then how explosive the guys who went in the early or late 1st, early 2nd also helped booster those teams. So when we look then at Jonathan Taylor, for example, you mentioned where he was going by ADP was, kind of between the 9 and the 10, but there was a period where he was going kind of in the 14th spot. So I do think that is a part of it. I also think that people are reacting to that situation of where he is this year. You mentioned Hill and Adams, and I think that changing teams is obviously a concern. We've looked in the past about teams changing or players changing teams and how they have sometimes struggled. One of the ones that recently went pretty well when changing teams was DeAndre Hopkins when he went to Arizona. So I think we're hoping that Hill and Adams are on that trajectory this year with where they are going in drafts, but they're also more aging wide receivers, and I think that's why they're slipping down in ADP. You do reflect in this article, Shawn, that the team that we actually had last year was at the 111. That had completely slipped my mind that is the team that came in second place in the FFPC tournament. But I do think part of it and the win rates from last year are going to be down to the injuries that also happened. You know, Derrick Henry's win rates would have been significantly different if he stays healthy, and that obviously then boosters those later draft slots and their win rates overall.
Yeah, I think that's very much. Yeah, I think that's a very good summation of what happened. I think that our team was the 112. I think that the team that Blair and I had that finished 31st in the main event in 2020 was the 112. And one of the kind of cool things here, Colm, and a little bit of this, again, is fluky. We'd like to mention, because I don't want any listeners to think that you follow what we say and you're automatically going to win. I mean, you're probably not thinking that, but just to make sure, a lot of these really good results are the combination of taking the evidence and taking these strategies, executing them properly, and then being fortunate in some situations. But the cool thing I think here is that there's a pretty clear disadvantage most of the time to not having a good draft slot. And yet the draft plans from the back, say third, that 109 to 112 range over the last couple of years, those teams have hit in such a big way that they finished near the top of tournaments. And that's kind of fun because it does lend credence to what the tools are telling us, which is that there are some exploitable opportunities here. And so what we've done in this exercise in the past, and what I do in this exercise in 2022, is to look at what a couple of tools are telling us in terms of likely scoring levels. So we have the range of outcomes tool, which is using historical matches for players to give a sense of what that production profile usually does the following season. And then we have the win the flex tool, which gives us implied points by ADP, again, using historical outcomes from 2017 to 2021 to give a feel for what running backs or wide receivers who are drafted in this particular range, what should we be expecting scoring wise, and is that exploitable? Well, in 2020, when Blair and I went hardcore zero RB, and it's one of the more extreme builds that we've done, we didn't draft a running back until round 11. The advantage for wide receivers over running backs, both in terms of what the ROO and the win the flex were telling us, that advantage was gigantic. And you were getting players like Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, Tyreek Hill, Julio Jones. And the contrast was that if you were going to be drafting running backs, you're getting guys like Nick Chubb and Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon. Now, Nick Chubb, obviously a very, very good player, but he has that limitation in fantasy that continues to manifest itself. And at this rate, basically being exactly the same guy, he's fallen into the mid-third. So that's how much fantasy has gotten sharper just in the last couple of years. Joe Mixon, obviously still hanging out kind of in that range. Josh Jacobs has fallen into the 5th, 6th, 7th round, just depending on where you're drafting, even though in many ways his thesis is the same. But for a lot of these guys, when they're going into year 2, whether it's a wide receiver or a running back, one of the reasons you get drafted up there is the potential. And as soon as a player is merely good and not great, they're going to fall off. That's one of the reasons why we recommend continuing to perpetually reload in Dynasty. You're going to get a little bit of that jump, but you're going to avoid all of the collapses when we look at how the expectations the players have and the expectation levels that you actually have to hit or else you're going to fall. Those change as we go through, right? So 2020, it was very, very wide receiver heavy. We jump forward a couple of years to 2022 and we see the receivers still have an advantage, especially guys like Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill. You're going to get decent prices on CeeDee Lamb and certainly T. Higgins at the back end. You're getting decent prices on Deebo Samuel, but obviously with Samuel, one of the things we've talked about is that Ayuk now is probably the way to play that offense. The contrast is that there are actually some running backs in this range that can hang with those players. So Derrick Henry, someone who has very good numbers in terms of the implied points, in terms of the range of outcomes points. He falls from time to time. Najee Harris, a back who will occasionally fall into the early to mid second, even in events like the FFPC Main Event. You've got Joe Mixon looking solid there. Dalvin Cook looking solid there. You have Alvin Kamara kind of dodging the suspension, it looks like, and he looks solid there. And then, Colm, the other question that we have is, does an elite talent that maybe the numbers are not going to properly encapsulate, is there a guy like that also sitting in that range? That was one of the things that we looked at last year, and one of the reasons that we took Jonathan Taylor, right? And again, mostly what we're trying to do here is to not chase running back points, to make sure we get this big wide receiver advantage. But if you have a Jonathan Taylor, then you want to take that shot. This year, the guy is probably Saquon Barkley. And one of the reasons that the numbers don't really support it is that he hasn't played that well recently, and he's missed a lot of time over the last couple of years. It's difficult to come back from that, even when you're still fairly young. But the reason that Barkley has risen from the mid-third to the 1-2 turn in the last 3 weeks is that a lot of those questions about health appear to be getting answered in a very positive way. The usage also seems to be very positive in terms of how the Giants are going to run their offense. So one of the big takeaways this season from the exercise is that, yes, you've got some great wide receiver options, but maintaining flexibility is something that we want to keep in mind. My draft was CeeDee Lamb at the 111, Devontae Adams at the 201. Colm, walk me through what you would have done if you're drafting here at the 111 or sort of anywhere in this range, kind of at the end of drafts. What do you like? What are your concerns? How do you think you should play this?
I think what you did with Lamb and Adams is a fair way to approach it. One of the advantages, this is obviously a one-off league where you're not going to get to do it in repetitive volume, but I have started quite a few drafts recently. When I was in the US, actually, I was able to get myself my Underdog account, use the promo code RotoViz to get a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100. And I was able to start some of those from the 112, and I was starting with Saquon Barkley and DeAndre Swift. So I was going to ask you, is Barkley another option, or Swift, sorry, another option to slot in there with Barkley in terms of those potential outcomes? In this draft, you take CeeDee Lamb, then it's Dalvin Cook, then it's Travis Kelce, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, Alvin Kamara, and then Saquon Barkley. Another player who's had a rise over the last couple of weeks is Kamara, with the likelihood of him being suspended seeming to be lower. Then directly after that is DeAndre Swift. I have been very tempted, even sometimes at the 111, to take Barkley or Swift in a couple of those drafts. I think that from draft to draft, that's going to vary, but I do think the value for me sometimes now at the back end of that first round into the early second round is to double up on those running backs and to try and hit those wide receivers then from kind of round 3 through maybe 9 and build a team that way. So I think that I realistically think that Swift probably should be going at the maybe 105, 106. I think in terms of running backs, him and Barkley, I think, are right there with Austin Eckler, who, you know, it tends to be going a little bit higher in these drafts, went off the board at the 104 in this particular format. I don't know if that feels too aggressive for you, Shawn. With Saquon Barkley being in the third round, it feels like maybe the 1-2 turn is already aggressive, but do you think that's a bit of a step? And when we talked earlier this offseason, we talked about, would the first round go back to being a running back heavy round directly after the season, or would we see running backs and wide receivers kind of split that? It has been pretty split so far, but I still feel like there's a gap in the running backs that are going in the second round. I think that both Swift and Barkley should be first round running backs at this point. I think that they both should be going over Najee Harris, for example. Both should be going consistently over Joe Mixon. You do see some of those guys sprinkled in there. Do you think that's too aggressive for those running backs? And had you any thoughts of, you know, you talked him in to go with Barkley and his potential range of outcomes this year. Had you a thought of taking him over Devontae Adams at that 202 spot?
Yeah, that was tough, right? And I think that there are some subtle but key differences between this type of format where it's full PPR and Underdog where you have the half PPR. What you're looking for in terms of the scoring levels from the players that you need to be ultra elite. Now, Connor has done some really cool articles looking at the influence of the 2-3-1 format in Underdog contrasted with the 2-2-2 format in FFPC. Obviously, that's running back, wide receiver, flex in terms of what you have to / get to start. In the Apex here, we have 2-3-1, but in a full PPR, this one very much leans in the direction of being wide receiver that I think you want to emphasize early. You want to take advantage of those extra implied points, and you're going to get the benefit of that as you win the race to the flex. And you're also going to get the benefit of not getting hit by that wide receiver avalanche. One of the things that we saw in the ship chasing main event, the chasing stolen bananas team that I drafted with Ben, Pat, and Pete, is that even in the FFPC main event now, you're getting some of these wide receiver avalanche drafts that you have to look out for. In this particular draft, after the first 2 rounds 3 through 7 were just crazy in terms of how wide receiver heavy they were. You don't want to get sort of out of position as it relates to that. But Swift and Barkley, the upside there is so extreme that in the most recent draft that I started with Connor and Underdog, a slow draft, we had the 112. You're not necessarily hoping to start with the 112, but I enjoy having the 2 picks back to back. I think most people do, even though, big picture, it probably doesn't give you the best win rates. It probably doesn't give you the best flexibility. It doesn't give you the best chance to grab values, because at least one of the 2 guys that you're getting there, to have 2 big values fall to you at the turn and be able to grab them both, that's not going to happen that often. But we started Barkley, Swift. I think that's a perfect beginning for that format and gives you a lot of flexibility then for that 18 rounds and how you want to build out a hyper fragile draft. Both Connor and I have some really cool examples of how to do that on the site using the RCE. But Colm, I'm excited to hear that you have Swift that high. You did tease a couple days ago the show that Ben and I did looking at the 2023 first round. And I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. We did have DeAndre Swift in that first round. Listeners will have to kind of jump over there. It is out and available to see just how high we had him. The scoring upside in Detroit this season, I think, is still underappreciated. The Detroit Lions are going to be a very good offense.
Yeah, I think they're going to be a lot better than people are expecting. That's one of the things with some of the YouTube videos that I've found. Some of the feedback on, say, for example, the Atlanta Falcons and Kyle Pitts, or DeAndre Swift or TJ Hawkinson, is these offenses are bad and they're not going to put up points. Similar with Seattle, for example, these offenses are going to score points, and it might be in garbage time, but you want to have those guys on your roster when they're putting up those points. And I remember, Shawn, last offseason we were talking about Taylor, and it was quite early in the process, but we were just kind of settled on he should probably be like the 106 at that point, and he continued to be an early second round pick for quite some time. It feels to me like Barkley and Swift are that way this year, and they just don't feel, when you look at the running backs in the second round, they don't feel the same as those other guys. So I've mentioned this on a few shows. It's not that I don't like running backs. There's certain running backs that I do like. I was talking to people when I was over in the US and that I had recently been touting drafting Derrick Henry. There is running backs that you will get me to draft, and we'll have some fun with that over the coming weeks. But Saquon Barkley looks to be in fantastic condition. And I know obviously you come back into camp, but I don't mean by conditioning as in that he looks, that he has a six-pack. I mean that he actually is moving about on the field and looks to be doing everything as fluid as he was in that rookie season. So look, these guys, if they're healthy and they're playing well, I think it's just so good for the NFL, so good for fantasy football, and we want to see the best players playing at 100%, and I'm hoping that's the case here for Saquon Barkley this season. Shawn, something else I want to touch on in this article, and we might bounce back to some other stuff in a second, is the being aggressive with a wide receiver start. If you are doing an extreme zero RB build, you do note 2 things in it. The questions that you get is, what's wrong with my zero RB team? And the other question is, when you draft a roster, I draft a roster, and we post it on social media, it is, why are you drafting so many wide receivers? That first question will answer. The second question is, you're not drafting enough wide receivers. So it also links in that to an article that you did, I believe, in 2020, which is struggling with zero RB. You're probably not drafting enough wide receivers. We see examples of this time and time again. I see people tweeting their zero RB rosters. I seen one when we were in Ohio that said zero RB done correctly, to which point we decided that we would dissect the roster as much as we could. But I do think that you have to be aggressive with this approach. You've been dealt a less advantageous hand when you get that spot at the back of the draft, and you mentioned it already, but not chasing, the kind of, everyone else has got that wide or running back at this point and taking just a suboptimal option at the end, but really trying to get the advantage at a different position. But when we are looking at these spots, Shawn, I guess the key thing is you touched on the win rates from 2021 and prior to that. How are you feeling about the potential win rates here in 2022 based on what we kind of discussed a little bit earlier? There is options that, you mentioned in this. You've taken Lamb and you've taken Adams, both still very high-end options. Sometimes you might get a Stephon Diggs there, Deebo Samuel, lots of different options that are available in those positions at the wide receiver. The tricky part is sometimes drafting those guys as they don't feel all that different sometimes to the wide receiver options that are maybe available at the 2-3 turn, so that feels like a disadvantage. But how are you feeling with those rosters and how they're turning out from the back end of draft so far this year?
I feel pretty good about that part of it. And one of the points that I made specifically about this format, and one of the reasons, we love Mike, and so we definitely want to promote his product, which is very good. But I also like talking about Apex because I think that the format that they're playing is so similar to what so many listeners are playing. It's that popular and neutral type of format. And so you can really take what you're seeing in this and use it to help prepare for your own league. And in this format, one of the cool things, as we talked about, there's this top 6 and then there's everybody else. But in this format, there's also a top 6 in the second round. Right. So this draft goes Travis Kelce, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift through the first 6. And then for me, and it's not going to be for everybody, but then for me, there's a tier break. And you have Joe Mixon, Aaron Jones, Leonard Fournette, Michael Pittman, Mike Evans, and Javonte Williams. Now, these guys are still second round picks. So there's no world in which they couldn't hit. Michael Pittman, it's really difficult to see from a data perspective how he can justify that. And yet if you read, you can't go 5 minutes if you're reading about the NFL without seeing that Michael Pittman is going to have a Cooper Cup type of season. So obviously he can hit. Some of the other guys in terms of Aaron Jones, Mike Evans, their paths are pretty tricky. Joe Mixon, not a big talent. Javonte Williams still dealing with Melvin Gordon. Those guys are not at the same level in terms of looking across their range of outcomes that you're getting from Kelce, Adams, Samuel, Kamara, Barkley, and Swift. And so I think it's kind of cool that kind of balances out, right? You don't get access to the top 6 stars, but you do have a little bit of an advantage in the early second round. And for me, one of the reasons that you would consider going wide receiver at the turn this year is that tier break after Deebo Samuel, and I think you could argue at this point even before him, with how that roster has matured and how much target pressure he's going to be under this year. You could argue that the tier break really happens after Lamb and Adams. It's one of the reasons why I went about it that way. I thought that Lamb was probably a little bit trendier. He might be a bigger risk to go at the turn, even though in many formats their ADPs are slightly swapped there. Lamb has this runway to massive volume this year. Devontae Adams has a resume that is just so unmatched. Even if you knock him pretty significantly for playing with Derek Carr, he still justifies being there, because if he were still with Aaron Rodgers, he would be right up there with Justin Jefferson. So from that perspective, you're getting stars, or you're at least getting upside that cannot be replicated the rest of the second round and in the third round. Really, the exciting receivers that start to come up again are in round 5. And so from that perspective, if you do start wide receiver, you have an advantage. And then especially if you continue to hammer that advantage. So that's one of the reasons we talk about, can you put yourself in a position where you get 6 of the top 15 guys? Now, you're not going to get 6 of the top 15 by ADP. You're trying to get 6 of the top 15 by scoring. And you're thinking, well, if I can't get them by ADP, then it's just going to be luck if I get them by scoring. But you can attack the profiles that have upside. You can attack the profiles that have room to grow and to run. you want to do that. And that's one of the reasons that we keep drafting, right? So you think about how this works. If you're not drafting a team to where your wide receivers can still punish the opponent at the flex position during the bye weeks, then you're not drafting enough wide receivers. If your roster cannot punish the opponent at the flex positions during the bye weeks after you suffered an injury, then you're not drafting enough wide receivers, right? So if you're not drafting a roster that can punish your opponent during the bye weeks at the flex position after you have an injury and after you have a miss, because we're not perfect, right? I mean, you're going to have players that you thought were going to be awesome who turn out to not be this year's Deebo Samuel. And, you know, you've got to have the Deebo Samuel in there as well, but you have to draft enough guys that you don't have to be absolutely perfect. That's one of the problems with going running back to start, is that suddenly you're thinking, okay, well, now within this wide receiver avalanche, I've got to hit on all my receiver picks. And suddenly I get a little bit conservative because I don't want to take a swing and miss. I can't afford that miss with the running backs. I get conservative. My ceiling lowers. I still miss. One of the veteran guys gets injured. And suddenly I'm sitting there with a team where I'm comfortable at running back, but I just don't have enough scoring to be the league champion. That kind of goes back to those questions you were asking. What's wrong with my 0 RB team? And why are you guys drafting so many wide receivers?
And the answer is you're not drafting enough wide receivers for your 0 RB team. So I think I'm going to have to make a clip of that, Shawn, and share it around that last 2 minutes. Hopefully the listeners enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to that portion. If you want to check out the full article, it is up on rotoviz.com. It will be linked in today's show notes. So do check that out.